Hey everybody, thanks for coming to my talk. This is a re-recording of a colloquium that I gave at Digital Promise on August 20th. So in this talk, I want to talk about a range of work that I've been fortunate enough to be involved in over the past really 6 or 7 years involving micro-credentials. In particular, I want to thank the generous support of the MacArthur Foundation. Connie Owell in particular was awesome in supporting my work over the years that I'll be talking about today and to work with my colleagues. Additional support was provided by the IU Vice President for Information Technology and Google. Huge shout out to my graduate students and collaborators on these various projects I'm going to talk about today. In particular, I'd like to single out Nate Otto, now at Concentric Sky, the author of the Badger IO, who was the project coordinator through a bunch of this work and who has taught me immense amounts of work. Also, thanks to the folks at Haystack and Mozilla. If you're watching the slideshow, you probably already know plenty about digital badges. I'm not going to go through the whole deal, but right, the most important thing is, of course, that they can contain specific claims of competence and they contain hot links of evidence supporting those competence. What I found is really important that a lot of people don't appreciate is it really matters what claims and evidence are included, and that this process of credentialing and recognizing learning this way can be both transformative and it can be disruptive. And that's in particular because open badges circulate. And this circulation really can amplify the meaning of the claims made by the badge and the evidence in the badge that support those claims. They also importantly amplify the deliberation of claims and evidence. If you post a badge making false claims, people are going to comment on it possibly, and that has a lot of implications for the nature of evidence that gets included. So what I'm going to talk about today are really several very overlapping projects. I'm on sabbatical in the fall of 2019, and I'm looking for people to collaborate with me on several projects in this regard. So I will summarize the completed work in the Design Principles Documentation Project. I'm going to talk about Endorsement 2.0, and that's ongoing. I'm really actively looking for collaborators who want to use this new functionality of digital badges. I want to talk about badge functions in the AECT handbook. I want to rewrite this chapter with badges other than the badges that came out of my big open online class. We've just published a set of motivational principles in the Cambridge Handbook of Motivation. I'm really looking for opportunities to do collaborative research that takes advantage of the fact that digital badges contain evidence to study and perhaps experimentally study the consequences of different designs. And then I'm going to summarize different research designs for doing that sort of research. You may be familiar with what we call the DPD project. This was a very intensive study of the 29 badge development projects that were funded by MacArthur in 2012. This was a super diverse group of projects. There you see the different categories within which they fell. What we did in this project, we really tried to capture the so-called practical wisdom around digital badges. This had never been done before. It was a brand new technology. We knew, in essence, every project was a pilot. I really liked Rich Halverson's notion of artifact-based frenetic narratives because if you think about it, the badge and especially the standards behind the badge that everybody has to follow if they're doing open digital badges, that itself is an artifact. And so the practical wisdom that we captured in this project, if you're using open badges, should be particularly useful to you because of that particular artifact. After a lot of deliberation, we organized this project around the following four functions of digital badges. We distinguish between recognizing and assessing. There turn out to be overlapping but different functions. I think we might have added to this another category called finding learning because so many people find opportunities to learn by seeing digital badges. What we did in this project was we looked at the intended practices that people outlined in their original proposals, and then we studied after the projects were underway, what were the enacted practices? You know, you said that you were going to award badges for writing scripts, and how's that going? Have you been able to do that? Um, and then finally, what are the formal practices? So what was really important to us is after the funding had run out, like what was sustained, what practices turned out to be sustainable without external funding. This is the website for the DPD project. If you Google that, Design Principles Documentation Project, uh, you'll find it. There is, for each of the 29 projects, you will find a very detailed account. In this case, Who Built America badges. This was a teacher education badges, of course, since that's what Digital Promise does. This is the one I focused on in this talk. At each website, or at each page, you can see in great detail, you know, have expert issue badges, and then the sub-principal credentialed via accredited entity and community. For example, you see here that they didn't intend to credential badges via the community. In fact, what they intended to do was credential via an accredited entity, and you can see that they were not successful at that. So what we tried to do in this project was to capture sort of the ideas, in particular the things that people thought would be a good idea, but they weren't able to do. We wanted to get those sort of, you know, what was possible before, you know, that those practices or that knowledge of what didn't work, the kind of thing that sort of evaporates as uh, teams dissolve and features evolve. These are the kinds of challenges that are embedded or that are relocated for each of these projects. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this talk right now. Everything's readily available at the website as well as in several publications. So here you see, so for example, 23 projects aligned badges to standards. So those were the summary of the intended. One of the most important things that we found, and this was at Mimi Ito's suggestion, this was an interesting project for me because it was very naturalistic. I'm a design-based researcher. My inclination is going to mess with stuff, and it was kind of hard for me not to insert my values and my beliefs. But when I turned in my initial draft of my report, Mimi said, you know, I don't see any of you, Dan. I don't see your voice in here. I know a lot about your interest, for instance, in participation-based badge systems. So could you work on that a little more? So in the end, what we decided to do, after a great deal of deliberation, we categorized what were ultimately 30 projects because one of the 29 projects had two badge systems. We decided that we could identify some of them as issuing competency-based badges, inquiry-based badges, participation-based badges, and then hybrid badge systems that had each of these different kinds of badges. And as you can see from here, you know, whether or not a badge system was thriving in 2015 after their funding ran out had a lot to do with what kind of badge system that they developed. So case in point, we determined that 8 of these projects were issuing competency-based badges. These were mostly implicitly associationist sort of information processing theories. They were mostly for formal recognition, like course credit, like trying to issue badges to get people course credit. These had a pretty extensive summative assessments, and the badges were functioning in many respects as extrinsic motivators because they were attached to other things. The competencies were measurable and measured. These projects had very ambitious assessment goals. In the end, the only project that was thriving was Buzz Math, and that was really a drill and practice math practice site. And the badges weren't even open badges. They were just literally tokens on the website. 3 of these projects were part of Gates's Project Mastery projects. These were well-funded, far more well-funded than the other remaining projects because Gates infused quite a bit of additional money into each of these projects. And for reasons that we've elaborated in the report, none of those projects really even made it past the pilot stage. One of them never even made it to the pilot stage. Now, if you want more information about those programs, of course, Gates funds a lot of very nice evaluations, and the good people at RAND did a very detailed study that captured the challenges of competency-based education. They didn't focus on the badges very much, but these were the kinds of challenges that they documented. I think anybody who's interested in starting a CBE program would be well advised to look at that. I think that from my perspective, I'm a fan of CBE, as I'll show you, but I think about a much broader view of CBE. You might want to take a look at the Carnegie report. This echoes many of the things that Rand found. It elaborates in key respects on the equity issues, the instructional challenges, and the challenges of supporting valued kinds of instruction that the latest learning sciences research encourages, in particular collaborative learning. and it really overlooks the very real limits of classroom assessment. The big takeaway for today, or for this part of the project, is that assessment's a real challenge and one has to be careful. When we look at the inquiry-based and project-based systems that issued what we called either inquiry-based badges or project-based badges, uh, these were more informal recognition. They had a lot of formative assessment components. Uh, Motivation was more intrinsic. You can also call these completion badges. You can assess whether or not somebody completed a project and award them a badge for that. So for the projects that were thriving, um, interestingly, already had these badges were layered into an existing instruction assessment ecosystem. However, even they scaled back their assessment and their quite dramatically. Um, Four projects were deemed to be existing. It means they actually got up and running, but we couldn't see any evidence, for instance, that learners were actively earning the badges and sharing them out over social networks. And then four of these projects never implemented their badges. I think that the four non-implementers had wildly ambitious plans that really just never came to fruition. Interestingly, the five projects that we deemed to be more participation-based badge systems, four of them were still thriving in 2015. These were more cohorted, where groups of people going through and learning together. Um, the recognition was more crowdsourced. There were more communal badges. The assessments are really what I would characterize as more transformative. Uh, that were meant to really transform ecosystems from our perspective. You saw a lot of social motivation, there were a lot of team goals. So these badges were really being issued for students taking on roles and identities. So I want to shift gears here now. Again, this is really a summary. This work is complete and published, but you can see here, here's an example. Use badges to promote discovery. Uh, Well, 4 out of 8, core function of badges, helping learners discover opportunities to learn. So 4 out of the 8 projects succeeded in this. So in the end, in our final report, this resulted in a badge principle called badges appear to have worked better when used to help learners discover opportunities. Here you see enhanced validity with expert judgment. Uh, this was a challenge in practice to implement. Many formalized systems ended up dropping this practice. We conclude badges work better when computer-based and expert assessment systems are carefully designed and based on successful examples. Additional motivational principles. So these badge design principles really were about, we drafted some initial principles, we formalized general principles, and then we began to try to bookmark research that was connected with those. So here's a list of the general ones. We concluded that badges work better when, for example, they presented unique information and evidence. So these principles are presented in the executive uh, summary of the project report, and they're really elaborated on extensively in several publications. So here's the more specific set of principles that came out of this project. That's the report. It's available at the website. We presented it at uh, ICLS in 2018, and it's just been accepted for publication in Educational Information Technologies. So now I'd like to shift gears and talk about work that I am actively doing and actively seeking collaborators on. So that's an editorial that I did in the Chronicle of Higher Education in 2017, and on the right is an article that I did with Nate Otto. They kind of mangled his name in that article, but we really tried to introduce the world to this Endorsement 2.0. This was made possible in the Open Badge Specifications 2.0 that Nate and others in the community drafted, that included in the metadata standards that are what makes open badges work, the possibility that people could endorse badges. And so I made the argument in the editorial that those who dismiss higher education e-credentials today are acting like retailers who dismissed e-commerce 20 years ago. In other words, I find a lot of parallels and basically argue that, you know, if you're dismissing e-credentials right now, your institution may go down the tube the way that Borders did when they were critiquing e-commerce in 2017, or I'm sorry, in 2007. So briefly, Endorsement 2.0 is a really important development because in Open Badges 1.1, there was a metadata field, right? So a badge, to reiterate, is nothing more than an image file that contains metadata fields, and those fields can contain JSON LD code. And the new ones include metadata fields that allow you to endorse the badge. So instead, Open Badges 1.1, there's a metadata field called endorser or called issuer. And whatever data you put in that, presumably the name of the institution of the person issuing the badges, that's the implicit endorsement. So 2.0 is a huge step forward because it allows third-party endorsements. Issuers can create profiles of organizations and individuals who can endorse badges. Then the organizations, presumably, can endorse a badge before it's issued. They can go in, for instance, look at a curriculum, and they can add an endorsing statement. You know, this organization examined this badge, and we believe that anyone who earns this badge meets those, is capable in the manner in which is claimed in the badge. After that badge is issued and containing that organizational endorsement, individuals, such as members of that organization, can endorse assertions and add an endorsing statement, presumably after they look at the evidence in the badge in light of the claims. And again, in this editorial, I argue that this is a lot like the way that consumer reviews, which really emerged around 2000, slowly created the trust network that allowed e-commerce to take off the way it did. So now I want to shift gears again and indicate another area that I'm interested in collaborating, actively looking for collaborative projects and have collaborative projects underway. So MJ Bishop, the awesome MJ Bishop. Many of you, if you're interested in badges, you might know MJ. So MJ was one of the editors on the last AECT handbook, and MJ is currently one of the editors on the new handbook. And MJ approached me because she and the other editors, Elizabeth Bowling, Jan Ellen, and Vanessa Svila, concluded that one of the problems with the previous handbooks and with educational technology associations is they're organized around technologies rather than problems. And so she asked me to do a chapter about badges that emphasize what are the problems that badges as a technology are trying to solve. And I was really happy that she had me do that because it helped me think about badges in a very different way. So I think that this chapter is kind of unique, and I hope that somebody out there will be interested in helping me rewrite articles that look at these functions using somebody else's badges. So in it, I argue that the current practices for measuring, credentialing, compelling, and accrediting achievement, they're outdated. They emerge alongside other practices over a century. They're opaque and analog. This makes them expensive, inefficient, and entrenched. And together, that really obstructs innovation in education and educational technologies. So we need to move towards capturing, recognizing, motivating, and endorsing learning. So the Lumina Foundation in particular represents a really comprehensive solution to this problem, the whole credential engine. There are other comprehensive solutions, blockchain, stackable credentials. Badges, open badges are really a more specific response to this problem. And so I think that it's likely easier for innovators to adopt badges to solve this problem. So this chapter describes 4 potential transformative functions of badges, right? So from measuring achievement to capturing learning, from credentialing graduates to recognizing learning, from compelling achievement to motivating learning, and from accrediting schools to endorsing learning. So the badges that I used in this chapter, after a lot of consideration, I decided to make it easy on myself and write about some really awesome badges that we developed in a Google-funded big open online course. Google Course Builder is a clean, it's 5,000 clean lines of Python running on top of App Engine. And Thomas Grenfell Smith, my brilliant programmer at the time, really was able to use the flexibility of it to take full advantage of the Open Badges 1.1 specifications. But as I'll show you, we were actually able to explore endorsement. I would have never been able to do this without Thomas's insights. This was completed by hundreds of students from 2013 to 2017. This is an expanded version of my existing course. It reflects my preferred approach to online instruction, and it follows very directly from the work of Randy Engel. So this is the assessment book. It's still up there running. If you Google it, you can find it. It's still actually, you can still sign up and take it, and people are still taking it at a self-paced. I had to move this course back into Canvas when I lost my programmer because I really just couldn't keep updating it. So this is the badge that you earn if you complete the educational assessment book and you get, as you see at the bottom, 80% or higher on the final exam. You get the educational assessment expertise badge. And when I said earlier that I'm a fan of competency-based education, when I say a broader view, notice the very first competency there is productively discuss and apply core assessment practices. So this is really important. As I'm going to show you, these badges contain evidence of that productive disciplinary engagement, PDE, as Randy Engel would call it. And I think this is one of the most important things about badges that many people don't realize. A lot of people in the CBE would be very dismissive of a competency such as discuss because they say you can't assess that. Well, it turns out you can. You can put that evidence in the badge and let people assess for themselves whether they think that's evidence of that competency. Notice that the last competency is recognize appropriate applications of core concepts. Right now, recognize is a very common competency, and that can be evidenced by the final exam score. So, importantly, what I showed in the previous slide, this information is that information was contained in the image. When we say that a badge is an image file containing data, the stuff in that top half, that was all contained in the badge. And the important thing is the evidence link in the badge will take a viewer of that badge to this information, which is actually stored on my website. And the fact that that badge contains 3 other badges makes this a pathway. This is a very important development in open badges. This idea of a meta badge that contains individual module badges means that it's possible to very quickly show someone what somebody had to do to develop the competency. So notice if we click on the assessment principles expertise badge, it takes us to that badge, and here you see again, this is the information that is baked into that particular badge. You can see that Len Adams, who was a real student, who was one of the dozen or half, 2 dozen students who took the course for credit because they were enrolled in a 4-credit degree program at IU. Again, you can see now, we drill down and we see productively discuss classroom assessment principles with professional peers. And that's evidenced by the number and nature of comments on the individual Wikifolios. Again, there's these other more conventional competencies, but notice I go from more participatory competencies to decrease bias in items, increase reliability of assessment. Those are kind of hard things to formally assess, but you can show evidence of a completed Wikifolio activity and the exam score. Those things together provide evidence of that. Now notice it says there, the expertise badge certifies that the recipient elected to take the exam and received 80% or higher. Now if somebody for each badge does not get 80% to take the exam, their badge literally will just say assessment principles. It will not indicate that they did not take the exam and didn't get 80% higher on the exam. So this is how we get around some of the interesting challenges that we face with FERPA. You're kind of not allowed to put people's grades out in public like this. So we're really enjoying exploring these issues and trying to come up with new ways that take advantage of the open nature of digital badges while respecting students' privacy. So here you can see this is the evidence included in the assessment principles badge, and there you see on the left the 3 modules that the student completed. If you clicked on that Unit 6, it takes you to the work the student did, and I'm going to show you that in just a minute here. So in this first category, from measuring achievement to capturing learning, there's this chapter, which I'm happy to share with you, and it should be coming to press any day now, we elaborate using these badges, these 4 different functions in terms of capturing learning that we've identified. So the first one is capturing richer evidence of learning context. Now, if we go back to that other slide and we click on Unit 6 validity, here you can see the actual work the student did. You can see a peer promotion at the top that Len earned for this work. I'll return to that in a minute. You can see right away the discussion generated 9 comments. You can actually, the viewer of the badge can actually watch the videos that I recorded for my class, but more importantly, you can see the instructions the students was responding to. Now, what's really important when we're talking about capturing richer evidence of learning is if you have a lot of expertise, say, in assessment, you could very quickly go in and look at the work they did on this assignment, comparing and identifying, literally ranking the most relevant type of validity evidence that this person saw. If you knew a lot about validity, you knew, for instance, that validity is a property of an assessment, and that's what makes it different than reliability, you could read this and very quickly get a sense of how deeply the student engaged. So similarly, you could go in and look and see whether the student actually, you could look at the discussion and see whether the student was capable of discussing it. Here's another set of functions, these 5 functions here, recognizing learning openly, recognizing a broader range of competencies. So I'm going to jump ahead pretty quickly and focus on the 4th of those, recognizing evidence to motivate learning. Um, So in 2016, I had the opportunity to debate Alfie Kohn at the Open Badges in Education conference in London. And it wasn't really a debate at all because Alfie Kohn said what he's been saying for years about extrinsic rewards, that we've already seen the literature. We know that if you give an extrinsic and arbitrary extrinsic reward to somebody for something that they're already intrinsically motivated to do, that intrinsic motivation will be diminished and they will choose to engage less frequently. That's the so-called over-justification hypothesis. And in Alfie's talk, he only focused on the things that sort of fit within that to basically say badges are just extrinsic motivators, don't use them that way. And Mitch Resnick and Henry Jenkins really echoed that comment. And my feedback to them in this chapter is then don't use them that way. Now, I do make other arguments in this chapter. First of all, the fact that digital badges, because they contain so much more information, unless they're used to, as tokens with no information, they're inherently more meaningful than other credentials that have been shown to diminish intrinsic motivation. I think that the circulation makes open badges particularly meaningful, and digital badges, because they contain evidence, are particularly consequential credentials. Now, I go out on a limb in this chapter and argue that I think the negative consequences of extrinsic rewards are actually overstated. As a situative theorist, I've been writing about motivation for much of my career, and in fact, one of the reasons that Connie Owell invited me to come into this community and work on these projects because quite a few years earlier in 2003, I had really extensively cited Connie's dissertation. She had published that in Elementary School Journal, and I published another article about motivation, my sort of manifesto, and cited Connie's very sociocultural analysis of motivation, of a Gotskian view of motivation, in explaining why drug awareness resistance education had been such a miserable failure. So the upshot of this is that if you yeah, okay, so maybe some kid experiences the over-justification effect. Maybe some kid really loved doing something, and that particular thing, getting the badge, the intrinsic motivation was so high that the badge really does undermine that intrinsic motivation. But there's other sources of motivation, cultural sources of motivation. So if everybody gets motivated to work on this thing and that creates value in that classroom community, that may likely overwhelm any undermining effect. Likewise, as Susan Heady and others are recently studying, we're seeing a lot of neurological evidence that badges about how even extrinsic incentives can create motivation. So I'm just saying it's a little overblown. Um, And if you're interested, email me. I'm happy to share copies of this, or you can get your library to access this handbook. It's a very good one, and I want to thank Kat Schenke for working with me on that. So what I want to focus on here is this endorsement function I talked about before. We were able to do what I believe may have been the very first implementation of endorsement. This was in 13, actually 4 years before the standards came out. So in each assignment, your students are instructed to endorse, they're instructed but not required, to endorse at least 3 of their classmates' Wikifolios for being complete. Now, and you see there at the bottom, your own Wikifolio needs to be endorsed by at least 1 classmate to count towards course completion. So you were able to endorse people for completing the required elements. This was for the open learners. The for credit learners needed to have it complete the required and the optional elements. So, and importantly, the endorser's name, they were actually named inside of the course. You could actually see the name of the person who endorsed the badge. That did not actually travel through to the external badge because I think that's where we drew the line with the privacy thing. So the numbers, as you saw earlier, the numbers of the endorsers were aggregated in the badges. Now, we found very few incomplete badges that were endorsed, essentially 0. That kind of problem that everybody worries about, it never happened. They were also instructed to promote 1 and only 1. They were only allowed to promote 1 as being exemplary. And you were required to add an endorsing statement that said what was exemplary from your perspective. So you can see in the text there at the bottom, we were really trying to get at notions of productive disciplinary engagement. And what was really interesting was that we awarded a leader badge for each section in the class for the student, for the member of each networking group that got the most peer promotions. And what was interesting was these were really popular. People really wanted to get those leader badges. Now, again, they weren't required to, and I think it's really important with these kinds of things not to require people. It's the same as I feel about discussions. You should never require people to participate in discussions if you want that discussion to be productive and disciplinary, because you'll otherwise just get people, doing sort of silly stuff, because they're required to do it. You want to find other ways to motivate people to discuss and engage and endorse and promote. So notice though that you were required to give an endorsing statement there. You can see your write-up on the confusion of construct-related validity was well stated. That's where the text that appeared at the top of the badge that you saw previously came from. So, and there you can see, again, going back to the badge, that's the top of that badge, and you can see there again where there were 3 endorsements and 9 comments that were provided. If you wanted to, you could go in and look at the contents of those comments. So say, for example, somebody's saying that they're in a good position to sort of lead an assessment reform effort with their high school peers because they took this course. And well, that's a pretty big ask of a principal, and the principal could go in and look and see the comments and really dig in and interrogate. So this is the important thing about badges. They really solve a problem with e-portfolios of not really knowing what something means and not really pointing to particular kinds of evidence that would be of particular use to people. So I'm really excited about those kinds of functions of badges, looking forward to doing studies with other people that explore them. I'm also really interested in partnering with someone who's implementing the Endorsement 2.0 standards, because there's a lot to be studied here, using, for instance, conversation analysis to study and do manipulations with different forms of digital badges and different configurations, and then analyzing the discourse that emerges around that. So let me wrap up this talk. We're at 33 minutes. That's getting a little long for me. Um, uh, So in a chapter that I wrote with James Willis for the proceedings in the second international workshop on open badges, I spent a lot of time struggling with, and so I'm going to close with this point. What I was very excited about in 2013 really was the recognition that, as a researcher and an evaluator, as an assessment expert, and as a supervisor of doctoral students, I know that one of the biggest challenges faced in education research is getting evidence of learning that's both reliable and believable, but also that is just getting that, and that's valid evidence that supports the claims being made. Well, because badges contain specific claims and evidence supporting those claims, you've actually got a really powerful source of assessment evidence for doing research. And in 2013, I imagined lots of projects, by this time would certainly be be looking into that. So what I did was I broke out um, sort of summative use of evidence in research purposes, right? So you can do summative research of digital badges, and you can use conventional evidence, but you can also use the evidence contained in the digital badges. You might do research where you use evidence formatively, uh, and that would be research for badges if it's conventional evidence, but if you use the evidence in the badges, that's research with badges and for badges. And then finally, transformative is really where you're doing, true design-based research, where you're using evidence to iteratively refine your designs to improve learning ecosystems. So, quick summary of this: I'd really love in the next 6 months to write a literature review with somebody else. Uh, ideally someone who's involved in the study, a graduate student who really wants to dig into the literature. Um, there's tons of studies of summative research of badges. It was most common in 2016. Oh my God, there's so many of them. We don't need any more. I get asked to do a lot of ad hoc reviews, and it puts me in a kind of an awkward position because on one hand, I'm seeing, research carried out by myself. They might cite my own stuff, but all these other studies of people who I think are doing good work, and then their own studies. I just don't think we need many more descriptive studies of badge systems. We certainly need more formative research of badge systems. Jim Diamond, the work that he did on Who Built America, I thought was a very good example of iteratively refining the way that they realize, for instance, that the assessment demands the demands of sort of getting experts to review completed work was just too much to ask. So they revised it. So there was lots of evidence that came out of it. They didn't use the evidence in the badges to make that claim, though. Finally, I think some of the best examples of transformative research are really, I thought that Barry Joseph and Rafi Santo, I misspelled his name once again. It is Santo with an O. At Global Kids and Hive, I was really able to cite some of their reports from very early on as a really good example of uh, really transformative research. And they also, though, are the only ones, I should have included that down below. They were one of the only examples I had in 2016 of using the evidence contained in badges to improve the badge system. So this next category, summative research with evidence from badges, of badges. So this is doing an evaluation of a badge system that uses the evidence contained in the badge. This is really what I'm hoping to see. I'm suspecting we'll start seeing very soon. I want to make a quick point about evidential validity. Carla Casilli really blew my mind in about 2012. 13 when she put out a blog post talking about why credibility was more important than validity. And initially I thought, no, that's like face validity. That's like, people like Jim Popham in my assessment textbook say that that's not really scientific validity. And by the end of her article, I really was convinced that she was right, that it doesn't really matter what an expert says about the evidence. If it's not credible, and it's not credible in the way that P.J. Fogg describes in his 2002 paper, and that Carla and I elaborated on in a 2016 paper in Education and Information Sciences, it doesn't matter what the experts say about the evidence. So, the fifth category, formative research, I thought that Stacy Cruz in the Corporation for Public Broadcasting badges and Lisa Dowley with her NOAA badges at Planet Stewards were both really promising examples of using some of the evidence in the badges to formatively improve their system. And then finally, the last category. In 2016, I searched. I really couldn't find anything that qualified for that category. But what really excites me is using new learning analytics techniques. You may be aware that the Badger IO has now been adapted as a sort of a default Badges plugin for the Canvas system. So people like Nate Otto, my student Joshua Quick, who are looking at these kinds of issues together, we're very, very excited about what might happen about generating learning analytics around badge systems using the newly available Canvas analytics to analyze that data. Well, let me wrap up here. So Bernard Bull called open badges a transitional technology, and I really think that's a good point. As I said in the editorial, we're going to have digital badges. There's just no chance that education is the only information-rich industry which won't be transformed by web-based digital technology. How that ends up being unfolding, I'm not really sure. I think there's many signs that open badges will prevail. The incredible growth of Credly, they just acquired Pearson's Acclaim. They're really going strong. Very interesting projects there. I think the Badger IO, the adoption by Instructure, the replacement of the Mozilla Backpack with Badger IO, these are all really important signs. There's another really important sign that I really hope, some clever graduate student is going to study. And that is the fact that Instructure acquired Portfolium. Portfolium is a very interesting portfolio system. It made its investors a lot of money. So Portfolium has done a very nice job integrating badges. So the fact that you now can put Portfolium in Canvas, you can put badges alongside your portfolios. If you're interested in this issue, get in touch with me. You might want to look at one of my blog posts on remediatingassessment.com, where I talk about a talk that I did, I think in 2016, really talking about the really important synergy between open badges and portfolios, and that badges function as boundary objects that can move information about competency across different spaces without losing its meaning. And then let me wrap up with a question. How might badges support social justice and equity? There's been very little discussion. Now, I think that the work that LRNG is doing is very important in this regard. Project LRNG, as you may know, is what became of when Connie Owell left MacArthur. LRNG is a very equity-focused platform that they merged with Southern New Hampshire University, and I think it's a very promising way to get many underserved and underrepresented students earning credentials on the open web to prepare them and being able to transfer those badges into courses at SNHU for course credit. As you can see here, when I searched for articles that included social justice and open badges in the title, I didn't find a single article. When I dug a little deeper and looked for ones that weren't in the title, I found a handful of examples that I thought were interesting and promising, and including a chapter that Chris Andrews and I did in 2004. So I'd love to see somebody really dig into that issue. I think that a lot of people who are concerned with social justice and equity, and I've learned this with my own students, they shy away from digital badges because they seem like they assume that this cliched and hackneyed idea that somehow increasing access to education is going to magically create equitable education. And I hope, as most of you are aware of, that there's plenty of evidence that that doesn't work. And there's a lot of arguments to be made that that's a really bad idea to think that way. So I'll leave it with that. My email address is dthickey@indiana.edu. Again, I'm looking for opportunities to collaborate in fall 2019 on sabbatical and going forward. So I hope you enjoyed my talk, and maybe I'll talk to some of you. Thanks a lot. Bye.